Hey, my fellow light explorers, hope you're all doing well. So I got a lot of requests to do a video on the Star Adventurer console app and walk you through all the features. The app is now called the SA console app in the App Store. I think previously it was called the SAM console app. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through all the features of the SA console app and point out some quirks that I came across, along with possible solutions to make your life a little easier. The one thing I'd like to point out is that this video is current as of May 2021, and that the features of the app might change going forward. So to address that, what I'll do is I'll leave any updates to this video in the pinned comment in the comment section below. So do check that out once you watch this video to see if there are any updates. This video is going to be quite long too, so what I'll do is I'll leave timestamps in the description box below, and you can click on or tap on the section that interests you the most. Finally, I have two other videos on the Star Adventurer, one being a complete setup guide for setting up your Wi-Fi version of the Star Adventurer, the 2i version, that walks you through the entire setup process, and another video that shows you how to blend a foreground image with a night sky, a tracked and stacked night sky. So check those out if interested. I'll leave links below in the description. Since we are using the app to control the camera, we need to connect our camera to the mount via a snap cable. So one end of the snap cable goes into your camera and the other end goes into your snap port on the mount. You can buy these snap cables in the Skywatcher store for your brand of camera. Now set the camera shutter speed to bulb and switch the mode dial on the mount to the app mode to start the Wi-Fi. So doing so will enable the Wi-Fi hotspot on your mount, and these arrow LEDs will blink slowly, signifying that the mount is ready to be connected to your device via the Wi-Fi. So now we go to the settings on our smart device. So tap on settings and then Wi-Fi. And once you're in there, you should see the SSID of your mount. You'll see a SYNSCAN Wi-Fi underscore certain numbers, and those numbers are unique to your mount itself. I'll show you later on how to change the SSID of your mount in the app. But for now, just tap on the SSID of your mount, and once connected, you'll see that there's a blue check mark next to your SSID. Okay, so now let's open the app. And once the app opens, you will see the SSID of your mount on the bottom left. Now in this case, I have changed the SSID of my mount, and I'll show you guys how to do that yourselves later on in the video. The text of the SSID should be green in color once your phone is connected to the mount via the Wi-Fi. If it is not connected, then just tap on the SSID and that'll open up a dialog box where you can find your device and connect to it. Now, Android users who are having issues connecting their phones to the mount, you could try and turn off the cellular data and then try to reconnect. Or you could try to set your phone to the airplane mode and then turn on the Wi-Fi and try and connect then. See if that helps. I've seen several friends of mine who have Android phones having issues connecting to this mount, but once they turned the data off, they were able to connect to it. Now, on the bottom right, you can see the current battery power of the mount. And please note that the red LEDs on the mode dial on the mount will blink at 2 times per second when the battery level is lower than 4.6 volts, or the USB power when connected to an external power bank is lower than 4.4 volts. Okay, let's now move on to using the app in astrophotography mode. So let's tap on the astrophotography option on the home screen of the app. And once you do that, you'll enter the astrophotography screen. Now make sure your camera shutter speed is set to bulb. Otherwise, the mount will not be able to control the shutter speed, and the shutter will close based on the camera shutter speed. And we don't want that. We want the mount to control the camera shutter speed. So make sure your camera's shutter speed is set to bulb. Now set the exposure time in seconds. Now note here that if you have the mirror up or self-timer mode selected on your camera, then the actual shutter speed will be lower than the programmed speed. So let's say you are in the default mode for sidereal tracking, where the default shutter speed is 120 seconds or 2 minutes. If you have your mirror up or self-timer mode selected on your camera, then the actual recorded shutter speed will be lower than 120 seconds. Next, you'll set the photo interval, which is the time in seconds between successive shots. So I normally keep this around 5 seconds, which is enough time for the image to be written to the memory card. Now set the number of photos you want after switching that mode on. However, for reasons I'll explain later, keep this off. Very important. Keep this off. This way the mount will continue to take the photos until you stop the sequence, which I'll explain later. Now choose the tracking rate. You can choose sidereal, solar, or lunar, and this will correspond to the sidereal, solar, and lunar modes on the mode dial. Now if you are dithering, you can switch that on and select the range. Do note that dithering is completely unguided. Dithering only works when the star adventurer is controlling the camera shutter speed and is not guided through the auto guiding port. This is understandable, as a mount needs to know when your exposure has finished in order to dither, which it really can't do if you are using an external intervalometer, right? Because if you're setting a shutter speed on the external intervalometer, the mount has no idea when that exposure is ended. So therefore, dithering on the Star Adventurer using the app only works when you have connected the snap cable to the mount and your camera, and the app is controlling the camera shutter. If you want to use an auto guider along with your Star Adventurer, then you will not be able to use the dither feature of this app. You can choose to use software like PHD2 in conjunction with your acquisition software to carry out dithering. More on that later. Okay, so what exactly is dithering? Dithering simply means to move something back and forth. In astrophotography, the idea is to move your mount a little bit between images. So this allows hot pixels, cold pixels, cosmic ray artifacts, and fixed pattern noise, and even satellite or airplane trails to be removed during the stacking process. Now, these artifacts and pixels appear in the exact same location on the frame, right? But because you're dithering, the image of the DSO will be shifted very slightly on the frame, but these pixels and the artifacts will be on the exact same location. So now when you align the image in your stacking software, when you align those DSO images in your stacking software, The DSO now gets aligned, but because you have moved the frames to align the images, the hot pixels, cold pixels, and the fixed pattern noise will now actually get randomized. And so now your software can remove these pixels and artifacts from the final image. The one thing to remember is that dithering on the Star Adventurer is only in the RA axis and not in the declination axis, because we don't have a motor that can move the Star Adventurer in the declination axis. But I would still say try and dither in the RA axis and see if that is beneficial to your image. Now, if you want to dither in the declination axis, you could use the fine-tuning adjustment knob on the declination bracket to move the camera gear randomly, very slightly, after every exposure, every 3 or 4 exposures. But I refrain from doing that because doing so would entail touching the gear, and that might throw your polar alignment out of whack. So I don't bother doing that. Instead, just stick to dithering in the RA axis and let the mount work its magic. Now, you may ask what number to input into the dialog box for dithering. Now, I use a formula that's shown on your screen. D is equal to 35 times P divided by F, where D is the dithering and arc minutes that you will need to enter into the dialog box in the SA console app. P is the pixel size of your camera's sensor, and that's pretty easy to obtain. Just enter what's my pixel size of my camera in Google, and you should see it. So for example, I have the Nikon D850, and if I enter what is the pixel size of Nikon D850 into Google, I get this number, and I simply enter this number in the formula above. F is the focal length of your lens or telescope in millimeters. Now, this formula is to dither by around 10 pixels. So, it's going to move it's going to dither or move the gear by 10 pixels each time. If you want to adjust the amount of dither, you can apply a factor. So for example, if you want to dither by 15 pixels, which is 1.5 times 10, then simply multiply the result obtained above, which means multiply D obtained above by a factor of 1.5. Now, in my experience, anything between 10 pixels to 15 pixels should work well. So what I would say is try and use this formula as is for 10 pixels. And if you aren't getting the results or you aren't satisfied, you could try 15 by multiplying that number by 1.5. Now there's some bug in the app where it won't let you enter decimal places directly in the dialog box. So to get past that, just enter the whole number. So let's say you want to enter 5.52 in the dialog box. So just enter 5 and press done, and you will see 5.00. And then simply tap inside the box and edit the decimal place figures. Delete them and put 5.2 in this case. So you should get 5.52. Next, we have the option to switch the Wi-Fi off on run.
which essentially turns the Wi-Fi off when the sequence starts, which means when you press run. And you can then turn the Wi-Fi back on by pressing the arrow buttons on the mount. Those two arrow buttons on the mount. The button LEDs will start to blink slowly, and you will then need to connect to the Wi-Fi. Now, I advise to leave this option turned off because this Wi-Fi left on doesn't consume much power, but more importantly, you won't disturb the polar alignment by touching the arrow buttons to turn the Wi-Fi back on. So my advice would be to leave this turned off, and there shouldn't be any issues with the battery life. Lastly, you can save each of your settings above under a profile name by clicking on the plus button to the right. That way you can just tap on the profile you want in the future and have the various inputs populated automatically without typing. I don't really use this feature because it's pretty straightforward to enter these 3 or 4, different inputs. So I don't really care about this, but I know some of my friends do enjoy this feature. All right, so finally just hit run on the upper right to initiate the sequence. You can stop the sequence at any time by tapping on stop on the top right corner. And this brings up a confirmation screen, and you can just tap on stop to stop the sequence. And also, anytime you want to check how many frames are remaining when a sequence is running, you can just tap on the status at the bottom of the parameters screen. And this should bring up the information dialog box about number of photos taken, the percent of task complete, etc. Okay, so now let's go over some observations I've had using this mount. Some caveats, some quirks, which hopefully make your life a little easier. So first, normally when choosing the sidereal, solar, or lunar modes on the mode dial on the mount itself, so you aren't using the app mode, but rather you are turning the mode dial to sidereal, solar, or lunar and connecting your mount to your camera via snap cable, the mount will trigger your camera with a shutter speed based on the default values, the factory default values, which actually in the case of sidereal tracking is 120 seconds with an interval of 5 seconds. And in the case of lunar and solar is 0.5 seconds of shutter speed with 1.5 seconds of interval between frames. You can confirm these figures in your manual. However, if you use the app to input a shutter speed or the interval and then run that sequence, things change. This is very important. Any setting you change in the app, so any setting that's your shutter speed, your interval, that you change in the app will get downloaded to that particular mode on the mount. So let's say you have used settings in the sidereal tracking mode in the app. So let's say you've put in, say, 3 seconds of shutter speed and a 2-second interval. Once you hit run, these settings will now get downloaded into the sidereal mode on the mount and become the default settings. So the next time when you turn the mode dial to sidereal and use the snap cable to connect the mount to your camera, you will not be getting 120 seconds of shutter speed. Instead, the mount will trigger your camera with a shutter speed of 3 seconds and an interval of 2 seconds. So this is super important. The default values get overridden by your last run settings in the app. The other quirk of this app is that the tracker will only track during the time a sequence is running and will stop tracking when the sequence is over. So this means, let's say you have framed your target, your DSO, and have turned the mode dial on your mount to the app mode. It's important to note that the tracker is not tracking at this point in time until you hit run in this mode. So let's say you've framed your DSO, you've turned the app on, and now you're waiting for half an hour for whatever reason, you want the DSO to rise higher in the sky, it to get darker. During this time, because you aren't running the sequence, the tracker is not tracking and the DSO will drift out of frame. Additionally, if you select the number of photos in the astrophotography mode in the app, then the tracker will only track until those photos are taken. So if you input 5 shots into number of photos to be taken and hit run, the tracker will then only track during the time the sequence is running, which means until those 5 photos are taken. Once those 5 photos are taken, the tracker will stop tracking and the DSO will drift out of frame. Now, since these settings get downloaded onto the corresponding modes on the mount itself, overriding any existing settings, the next time you choose to use the mode dial on the mount, instead of using the app mode, the mount will now do 2 things. First, if using a snap cable to trigger your DSLR based on the mount's settings, the mount will command your DSLR to only take the last programmed number of shots. So if you have programmed 5 shots to be taken the last time round, your DSLR will only take 5 shots and then stop. I've had several friends who had programmed a certain number of shots when using the app mode, and then the next time round they used the sidereal mode on the mount, and the mount stopped tracking after a while and they were completely flummoxed. And this is the reason. It's because you had chosen the number of photos to be taken, and that data gets downloaded into your mode dial on the mount and becomes the default value. So the next time you use the mode dial on the mount will only take the same number of photos you had specified the last time round when using the app. To get over this hurdle, do not check the photo box in the app. In other words, do not select number of photos to be taken in the app. You should see infinity hours to the right, signifying that it will take continuous photos. When you do this, the mount will continue to take photos until you turn it or the DSLR off. The second point is the mount will only track until the time equivalent of the last program settings is completed. So for example, let's say you had chosen 10 photos of 1 minute each with an interval of 5 seconds between each. Then you hit run, the sequence runs. The next time when you now use the mode dial, switch to sidereal to take the exposures, the mount will now only track for those 10 times 1, which means 10 minutes, plus the 45 seconds of the interval between the shots. before it stops tracking. So it'll only track for 10 minutes and 45 seconds and then stop tracking. Any additional exposures after those 10 minutes and 45 seconds of time will be untracked and will have movement. I see this as a common complaint with the Skywatcher Star Adventurer, and I really wish Skywatcher would issue a firmware to let the mount track continuously, regardless of the number of photos taken or input. I'd reached out to them on a couple of occasions, and they said they had no immediate plans to address this. Remember, since any changes in the app get downloaded into the tracker, they override any current settings. So let's say on the first night, I chose 10 shots to be taken using the app. Then the next night, I don't want to use the app to control my camera, but I now use an external intervalometer to take, say, 20 photos. I program my external intervalometer to take 20 photos, set the mode dial to sidereal, and start taking the shots. Since I had chosen 10 shots the previous night via the app, when the app was controlling my camera using a snap cable, the tracker now will only track for the time equivalent of those 10 photos, even though I'm taking 20 shots this time round using an external intervalometer. In other words, once the program sequence is completed, the tracker will stop tracking. The simplest solution is that you can turn off or uncheck the photo section in the Astrophotography menu. This will make sure the tracker tracks continuously, but you will physically need to turn the mount off, which is fine, right? But at least the tracker will be tracking continuously and will not stop after taking a certain number of photos. If you find you're having issues with tracking, or you're not sure if the mount now has overridden settings, overridden the default settings, then just do a simple reset of the mount. Anytime you have issues, just reset the mount to default values. And you can reset the mount at any time by pressing the arrow keys together for 5 seconds until they blink rapidly. So this will reset all the settings to default values, including the name of the Wi-Fi hotspot if you've changed it. So for example, this will reset the shutter speed in the sidereal mode to 120 seconds, which is a factory default. So this also means that if you had enabled dithering the last time round you had used the app when you ran a sequence, that also gets downloaded as default into your mode dial on the mount. So if you use dithering for sidereal with a certain input for the arc minutes, say 5, then that gets downloaded into your mode dial, and the next time you use or turn your mode dial to sidereal on the mount and use a snap cable to connect your mount to your camera, the mount will dither the images based on that last dither settings. So I think if more of us sent an email to Skywatcher to try and get a firmware to keep the tracker running at all times in the app mode and not turn it off, then they might do something. They aren't currently getting enough people telling them that it's an issue. So if you can, write to Skywatcher at support@skywatcherusa.com, letting them know that you want a firmware upgrade or update, which will let the mount keep tracking regardless of change in inputs in the app. then they might make this very minor change in the future. Okay, so now let's move on to the Astro Time-Lapse mode in the app. Now with the Astro Time-Lapse, the Star Adventurer combines astrophotography and time-lapse functions to create time-lapse videos of celestial objects. In Astro Time-Lapse, we take multiple images and the camera moves with each exposure. So the camera will track the stars or the Milky Way as it moves across the sky to prevent trailing. But unlike in astrophotography, the Star Adventurer returns the camera to the starting point after each exposure is completed. So now when the frames are sequenced into a video, you will see the night sky moving about a fixed terrestrial reference point. You may have guessed already, but polar alignment is required for Astro Time-Lapse. So just carry out the polar alignment as you would for regular astrophotography. Now let's go through the settings. For the exposure, set the exposure to get a proper exposure of the sky. Make sure you are connecting your camera to the mount via the snap cable for your brand of camera so that the mount can control the camera shutter speed. The camera shutter speed needs to be set to bulb, else the mount will not be able to control the camera shutter speed. It'll simply use whatever speed's there on the camera. Next is the video time span in hours, and the video time span refers to the actual amount of time that elapses from the start to the end of the video recording. So this is the actual real time. The video time span is impacted by the exposure, photos, video length, and frame rate, and will be calculated for you. You can also set a value for the video time span along with setting the length for the time-lapse video, which is the video length, and the frames per second. And then the other parameters will be auto-computed. However, I suggest you leave this option turned off so that it is computed automatically. Now we input the video length in seconds. Now this is the total length in seconds of the actual finished time-lapse video. This is not the video time span. This is the actual length of the finished time-lapse video in seconds. So just enter how long you want the finished time-lapse to be in seconds. Next we have the frame rate, and you can select the NTSC, which is 30 frames per second, or PAL, which is 25 frames per second, according to the video standards of your location. Then we have photos. So this is the number of photos you want to take for your video. My suggestion is don't check this box and let it be computed automatically for you. So by setting just the exposure and the video length, all the other fields will be auto-populated by the app itself. So that's really about it, guys. It's pretty straightforward. The main entries you have to make are exposure and the video length in seconds, and that's it. So lastly, as mentioned before, once you input all these values into the Astro Time-Lapse mode on the app and hit run, these values now get downloaded into the corresponding mode on the mode dial on the mount and become the default values for the future. So all these values now get downloaded under the Astro Time-Lapse mode on the mode dial. And the next time you turn the mode dial on the mount itself to the Astro Time-Lapse mode, these values of the exposure and the video length, etc., become default. Okay, so now let's move on to the regular exposure time-lapse mode. So the major difference between the regular exposure time-lapse mode and the long exposure time-lapse mode is that in the latter case, the rotation stops during the exposure. So this enables the sensor to capture more of the available light, resulting in a better image. The parameters for regular exposure time-lapse and long exposure time-lapse are exactly the same except for the exposure parameter. In the regular exposure time-lapse screen, you cannot change the value for exposure. It is fixed at 0.5 seconds or half a second, which is a requirement in order for the star adventurer to provide an adequate signal to control the shutter of your camera. Now, do note that this half a second period is automatically taken into account when the app calculates the video time span parameter. So essentially, this regular exposure time-lapse mode is only for daylight use, and you set the exposure on the camera. The mount is just sending a signal to trigger the camera. Now, at this point, please note that because several of the parameters are interrelated, some may be unavailable at certain times. So for instance, when frame rate and video length are set by you, you cannot manually choose the number of photos, as that is computed automatically based on the other two parameters. Next, we go on to the video time span. And this is simply the actual time elapsed between the start and the end for your video. So for example, if you want your video to cover a time span of 3 hours, you will set the time span to 3. Do note here that the video time span does not refer to the length of the finished time-lapse video. It only refers to the actual time span over which the video was created. My advice is to leave this alone and let this be computed automatically. Next, we have the video length in seconds. And here you will enter how long you want the finished time-lapse to be. So for a 1 minute long time-lapse video, you will set the video length to 60. Next, we have the frame rate, and as before, choose NTSC or PAL. Then we have the photos, and as before, you can select this, but I advise to leave this alone and let the app compute this for you. The app will compute using the formula photos is equal to video length times the frame rate. So all the app will do is take the video length and multiply it by the frame rate to get the number of photos. Then we have the frame period in seconds. So you can set the frame period to select a desired interval between photos rather than have it computed for you. Okay, then we have the swing range in degrees. Now, you can use the swing range to create an interesting swing or pendulum effect for your time-lapse video. So when used, the star adventurer will pan to the limit of the swing range that you set, then pan back to your starting point as many times as specified in the swing count parameter. So for instance, say you have two interesting subjects that you want to feature in your video. Now set the swing range to the angle between them and the swing count to 1. Then point your camera at the first subject. As the time-lapse video is being recorded, the star adventurer will pan from the first subject to the second one and then stop. By setting the swing count to 2, it will pan to your second object, then back to your first object, then stop. So by using the swing range values greater than 1, you can have the star adventurer pan back and forth multiple times during the video. You can set a swing range to 0 for no panning and to an even number to always end up where you started. Okay, next we have the speed, And the speed determines how quickly the star adventurer will pan. In most cases, you don't need to set this parameter unless you want to control the panning speed yourself. If you do not want Star Adventurer to pan in your time-lapse video, then set the speed to 0. Next we have clockwise. So when you switch this on, it will cause the Star Adventurer to rotate left to right when viewing down with the mounting platform on top. Off will cause the Star Adventurer to rotate right to left. As for the other options like Wi-Fi off on run, profiles, then heading run, and status, please refer to the prior segments. I don't want to repeat the instructions since I've gone through them twice already. Alright, so now let's head to the long exposure time-lapse mode. And as mentioned before, the main difference between the regular exposure time-lapse mode and the long exposure time-lapse mode is that in the case of the long exposure time-lapse mode, the rotation stops during the exposure, which enables the sensor to capture more of the available light, resulting in a better image. Now, in the long exposure time-lapse mode, the exposure parameter controls the exposure time setting of your camera and can be set to suit your needs. For night scenes where a small aperture and low ISO value is used, individual exposures may range from a second to several minutes. So take some test shots to establish the best settings and exposure for your needs. Then enter that value into the exposure parameter field. Again, you must set your shutter speed to bulb mode, otherwise the shutter speed setting on your camera will take precedence over the value in the exposure field in the app. And then all other settings are exactly the same as for regular exposure time-lapse mode. So I will not be going over those once again. Please refer to the prior segment to look at those inputs. Okay, the next option in the home screen is the manual control. And the manual control just gives you the ability to nudge your camera, but without touching it directly. It basically moves the RA axis of the mount very slowly. And I personally have never used it, but you can use it to fine-tune the framing. Now, do note that the left-right buttons on the actual mount itself can also be used to slew the camera at higher speeds, so about roughly 12x the celestial tracking speed. And you can slew it in only 6 pre-programmed function modes. So sidereal, solar, lunar, Astro Time-Lapse, the regular exposure time-lapse and the long exposure time-lapse. The slewing function has no impact in the app mode because in the app mode, these buttons are only used to enable the Wi-Fi if it has turned off or has been disabled. So using the buttons, you can actually just, frame your DSO without having to unlock the clutch and then rotate or slew the gear towards the DSO. It's more controlled. Okay, now let's go on to settings and have a quick look. So once you tap on settings, you come to a page with several options. First, it's a language, so you can choose your language out there. In the night mode, you can choose on, off, or auto. If you choose auto, it'll figure out when it's dark and then turn on the night mode for you automatically. When you tap on location, you can enable the location sensor, which will determine the coordinates for you based on GPS data. Now the Wi-Fi auto off feature, you can actually tap that and turn that on to choose a delay to automatically turn off the Wi-Fi to preserve power. Then the Wi-Fi will turn off when there's no Wi-Fi activity during the auto off interval. Now I personally leave the Wi-Fi on at all times because to turn the Wi-Fi back on, or when you use this, you would need to press the left-right buttons on the mount and that might hamper or change the polar alignment. Then we have the auto run task, and if you enable that, the Star Adventurer will automatically restart the previous photography process when the mode dial is turned into app mode the next time. And finally, you have the Wi-Fi network, and you can actually go in there to change the SSID of your Wi-Fi. And you can also use the STA, which is a station mode, which will control the Star Adventurer while being connected to a Wi-Fi network for internet access. So if you plan on using the STA or station mode, you will need the SSID and password of the Wi-Fi network. And if you enter the incorrect information, you may have to reset the Star Adventurer to factory settings. So be careful about using this mode. The AP mode is the default mode, and in this mode, the Star Adventurer acts as a wireless access point so that you can control it via the SA console app. For the AP mode security, just select open if no encryption is to be used. Otherwise, tap on the settings field and choose an encryption type from the list and enter the correct password.
Alright guys, so that concludes my little video. I really hope you enjoyed it. As mentioned earlier, I'll leave links to the 2 other videos pertaining to the Star Adventurer in the description box below. Now, I'm working on a video with some tips and tricks on using the Star Adventurer, and I've got some pretty cool ones, so look out for that video. If you like this video, then like, share, subscribe as always. And until next time, this is the Light Explorer signing out of beautiful Joshua Tree National Park.